now. All right, so that's going. I don't want to take any more time, so I'm thrilled to introduce our speakers today, Amanda Montgomery and Srila Nambudiri, who are from Heartland Health. I'll let them introduce themselves and get going with our presentation today on compassionate approaches to nutrition. Take it away.
All right, thank you everyone, and thanks Cease, and thanks to Corey Bloom as well, who connected us here so we could be with you all bright and early this Friday morning. We are so happy to be here, and yes, please continue to feel free writing in the chat a favorite food and why it's a favorite food, and or a memory, a food memory that you'd like to share. It's been really fun just reading the ones that have come through, because we can see that food is pleasure, right? Food is joy, food is celebration, food is connection to our ancestors, food is memories. And so how really complex food is, much more than just like eat this, not that, and nutrition. So my name is Srila Nambudiri. Again, I'm an integrative family medicine doctor at Heartland. And my pronouns are she and her. And I'm also presenting here with Amanda.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Amanda Montgomery. I am, my title at Heartland is the Manager of Community Health Education, but I'm also a dietitian, and I do a lot of community wellness, community outreach work there. But yes, we're so excited, and my pronouns are she, her. Yeah, so thank you all so much for being here. We're super excited to do this presentation with you all. Yeah, so that's Srila.
Yeah, so the official title of our presentation is quite long, exploring the roots and misconceptions of weight as a measure of health and compassionate approaches to nutrition. So it's a two-part. So today we're really focusing on the first part of this, which is a lot of content, and then next week we'll do some breakout groups and things like that. And so our agenda for these two sessions with you all is, first, we're going to focus on reviewing why we should take a weight-inclusive approach to care, and again, explore the history and roots of weight in medicine. And then kind of starting next week, we're going to learn about how we can talk about bodies in a more compassionate way. And we're going to practice together in breakout groups with 3 case study examples to explore a compassionate approach. And lastly, we're going to reflect on our own experiences with food and our bodies and how those things have shaped our views and our practices. But just as we start with you all here, we'd like to first honor and give gratitude to the land that we live on, that we're all gathered here on virtually today, and the original people of this land, which includes the Potawatomi, the Peoria peoples, Kaskaskia, Miami and Kikopoi peoples, and likely many others. And Amanda and I would also like to just take a moment and give gratitude to our own teachers, which includes our patients who have passed on wisdom to us so we could share wisdom with you today. And we also want to recognize the many, many writers, activists, researchers, and healers who we've listed here that have inspired us on this journey of compassionate, size-inclusive care. There's a Google document down here that you'll all get the link to, with a list of citations from research articles and books that we reference in this presentation. And while the academic research articles were really helpful in educating us in this topic, and we'll share a lot of that with you today, really the most important and impactful learning that we've had has been from like listening to and reading the words of people in larger bodies and people of color in larger bodies. And that's really where we would recommend you starting on this journey, or if you're starting. So for example, reading the really powerful memoir Hunger by Roxane Gay, or reading the book Fearing the Black Body, the Racist Origins of Fat Phobia by Dr. Sabrina Strings. So may this slide be a source of inspiration for you if you're beginning your journey or continuing your journey of size-inclusive care. And also, before we begin, we just want to give a content warning, because we're going to be discussing a lot of really heavy topics that can be triggering to some of us based off our own identities and lived experiences. We'll be using the term obesity, which is actually a term that neither Amanda nor I use anymore, because it can be stigmatizing. but it's prevalent in research and still commonly used in medicine. So for that reason, we're using it in this presentation. And we're also going to be discussing fat phobia, weight stigma, dieting, eating disorders, trauma, and abuse. So please, listen to your body. If you're feeling unsettled or triggered in any way, definitely you can turn off your screen, drink some water, take a break. This is recorded, so you can always come back to it. There's no need to push yourself this morning. And lastly, before we start, we want to just note our privileges and that we hold, and therefore we have blind spots and may not be able to provide a really full whole picture of this topic. So for myself, I'm a cis woman and I live in a straight-sized body. So experiences of weight stigma and fat phobia are not ones that I've had. I'm also able-bodied and fairly neurotypical, which has allowed me to navigate this world more easily with less stress than someone who's differently abled or more neurodivergent. And I have caste privilege and I have class privilege, which have given me a level of financial security and access. I'm a physician, which has given me access to spaces like this one, where my voice is heard, and valued, even though my voice is not more valuable than anyone else's, and especially not more valuable than someone with lived experience in this topic. So we have blind spots, and we definitely welcome any feedback that you may have for us.
And similarly to Srila, I also am a cis woman who lives in a straight-sized body. I'm able-bodied and neurotypical, so I share a lot of those similar privileges. I'm also white and have a lot of privilege in that, and also college educated and a registered dietitian. And I think in spaces like these, especially when we're talking about food and nutrition, that can allow me into spaces and maybe some more trust than other folks that have just as much wisdom. And we'll talk about it a little bit, but it's important to be critical of dietetics as well. It's a very, very white science with roots in racism, and a lot of the recommendations we make are from white people for white people. So it's important to also be critical of the nutrition science that we have as well. All right, so we're going to jump into it. Feel free anytime to put questions in the chat. We might not get to them today, but we will for sure answer them next week if there's not time at the end. But today we're going to do this part one, which is exploring the roots and misconceptions of weight as a measure of health. So the key questions that we're going to answer in this presentation are: what is the history of medical fat phobia and how is it rooted in racism? What is the quality of the data about BMI, weight loss medications, and bariatric surgery? What does dieting do in our bodies? And how does a weight-centered approach perpetuate shame and ignore trauma? So I just want to start by painting a picture of this world that we live in, right? We are overwhelmed and bombarded by messages in the media, from our family and friends, and so many other places, that there's a right way to be healthy, that everyone needs to be thin, that there are foods that are good for you and foods that are bad for you. And most patients that Srila and I talk to have a negative relationship with food in their bodies. And so diet culture, this like system that we live in, is impacting all of us, right? Maybe we've all probably felt guilty at some point because we ate too much at a party, or maybe felt pressure at some point in our lives to look a certain way, right? And so this is kind of envisioning, what if we could live in a world where none of us felt this pressure, none of us felt any of this shame. And so this is impacting all of us, but this system is actively harming folks in bigger bodies. And so we're going to talk about the way that harm plays out today. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the history of where we get our ideas about body size. So historically, we've had beauty ideals that favor larger people. So larger bodies were associated with prosperity, while thinness signified poverty and weakness. So I think this shows first that this idea that like thin is healthy and right and good is really new in the history of human civilization, but also that body diversity is natural. There have always been, and there always will be, people that live in larger bodies, and it's not necessarily like relevant to their health status in any way. And then thinking through the like white supremacist lens of history that we get a lot of the times, fatness was okay in white communities until they encountered Black people. And so Darwin and Linnaeus and other race scientists created this hierarchy of civilization and put white men at the top and people of color, especially Black women, at the bottom, and used fatness or differences in body size or eating behaviors as a way to mark uncivilized behavior and distance white people from Black people. And so body size was used as a way to justify eugenics, slavery, and racism. And so the fat phobia, or this like fear of gaining weight or being bigger that we have in society today, is a direct consequence of that history. And you can see this play out in a lot of different ways throughout the 1900s and even today. But just an example is, in the 1900s, this idea of temperance, which is like not eating too much because it's immoral, was encouraged, and this idea of thinness was amplified. And so this diet and pharmaceutical industry like really boomed to help everybody lose weight or stay thin. And it's now a $70 billion industry that we have that's keeping us stuck in perpetual cycles of shame. And so a theme that runs through all of that is the idea of desirability politics. And so I want to read this quote by Ella Prisbillo and Sarah Rodriguez from On the Politics of Ugliness. And it says, "Ugliness or unsightliness is much more than a quality or a property of an individual's appearance. It has long functioned as a social category that demarcates access to social, cultural, and political spaces and capital." So the dominant white culture has created this social construct that deems certain people beautiful, often based on how closely they align with European beauty standards, like being thin and white. And those people are ones who get access to more capital, right? And it systematically prevents people from who don't fit in this box, like folks in bigger bodies and other marginalized groups, from accessing that same capital. And so when we talk about weight loss with people, we're reinforcing the idea that health and capital are only accessible to people if they change themselves to fit European beauty standards, rather than thinking that health and capital are right no matter what body you live in. And I just want to highlight three books, just three of the many books that have been super helpful for me in understanding this history and the intersection of race and class and body size. And so Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness by Deshaun L. Harrison, Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings, and The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor are all super amazing books that I would recommend you all check out if you're interested in learning more about that. And then I want to touch a little bit on how body size, like this focus on body size, got incorporated into medicine. And it really wasn't recommended medically before the 20th century, but because of the popularity in society, everyone was talking about it and it kind of got incorporated into medicine that way, and through the popularity of the BMI, which I'll talk about in a second. But I want to just highlight a few key points, things that happened more recently in our history that have kind of changed the way that we think about body size. So in the 1990s, the NIH lowered the BMI limit from 27.5 to 25. And that was encouraged by information from the International Obesity Task Force, which is funded largely by pharmaceutical companies for weight loss drugs. And this, first of all, caused a lot of people like overnight to be categorized in a higher BMI category. And that just created a lot of fear and activity in public health around the obesity epidemic, and kind of created this refocus on body size. But it also shows the role that big pharma can play in a lot of these spaces on controlling or influencing what types of things that we talk about talk about in medicine. And then in 2013, the American Medical Association actually brought in a task force to evaluate the relationship between weight and health and understand if they should classify obesity a disease. And the task force spent a year of reviewing and after that year said, no, it shouldn't be considered a disease because there's a lack of characteristic signs and symptoms due to obesity and a lack of evidence of any true causal relationships between obesity and morbidity and mortality. But despite that information, the American Medical Association voted it a disease anyways. And that's really impacted the way that we talk about health and the roots of health issues in medicine today. And then just a little bit of history about BMI because it's so prevalently used as a proxy for health in medical spaces and research. It actually was not even developed for medical use. It was developed in the 1830s by a statistician named Adolphe Quetelet, who was like trying to understand the average proportions of the average human. It wasn't for medicine, and he only used data from white, French, and Scottish men. But somehow in the 1900s, life insurance companies like found this index and started using it to set insurance premiums, and it just kind of like grew in popularity and people started learning about it and it got more incorporated in spaces. And so in the 1950s and 60s, Ansel Keys, who's a very famous researcher you've probably heard of, he's also quite fat phobic, took it upon himself to figure out what the best tool to assess weight was. And so he looked at 3 tools, and out of the 3, he determined that BMI was the best tool to use, even though it was right only about half of the time. But that being said, BMI really made its way into medical spaces and research spaces after that. And there's a lot of flaws with the BMI. First of all, of course, the equation was only developed based on white men, so it's not representative of the entire population we have in this world at all. But it also doesn't consider body composition, so things like muscle mass, fat mass, bone density, or health behaviors or any other things in your world that can impact your health besides your weight. So that was a little overview of the history, and you might be thinking, okay, that's interesting, but obesity or weight loss for obesity is evidence-based. So we're going to look a little bit at what the data say, the evidence says about BMI and weight loss methods, and then also medications and bariatric surgery. So I'm just going to highlight a few key studies about the BMI. The first one is a big study of over 40,000 US adults using NHANES data. And they looked at metabolic health stratified by BMI category, and they defined metabolic health as cholesterol, triglycerides, blood sugar, blood pressure, and CRP levels within normal limits or not on a medication, and found that nearly half of people in the overweight BMI category and 30% of people in the obese category were metabolically healthy, and over 30% of people in the normal weight category were metabolically unhealthy. And so if you extrapolate this out to the entire US population, it indicates that we are misclassifying almost 75 million people as either healthy or unhealthy for just using BMI alone. And then another study in 2005 out of the CDC found that people in the overweight BMI category actually had lower mortality rates than those in the normal weight category. And so this kind of reflects the obesity paradox, right? This idea that like it's like unfounded that people in bigger bodies could actually live longer or maybe actually be protected in terms of their longevity. And but I think both of these studies go to show that you can't tell anything about anybody based on their BMI alone. So looking at the weight loss data, short-term weight loss data shows that people do lose some weight, but long-term data shows that regardless of initial weight lost, most weight is regained after 2 years, with up to 2/3 of dieters likely to regain more weight than they even lost on their diets. And this is supported by a lot of research, the NIH, and a lot of practice guidelines as well. So I'm just going to show you 2 studies. This is the type of chart or graph that you'll see in a lot of weight loss studies. And the one on the right actually is the Women's Health Study. It's the longest dietary intervention clinical control trial with over 20,000 women. And what you'll see a lot of the times in shorter term weight loss studies, like the one on the left, is, you'll see that trend line go down, right? So folks are losing weight, but around the 6 months to a year, you'll start to see that trend line go back up. And a lot of studies will stop the study before they let that trend line even all the way out and say that there was a net loss or that there was success, without waiting to see what happened over time. And a lot of the times, if you do have long-term data, you'll see that trend line pop all the way back up. And then in thinking about the quality of the data, there's a lot of flaws in weight loss data. So first of all, there's high attrition rates, up to 70% of people that drop out that aren't reported a lot of the time. There's multiple interventions. So if a study is looking at weight loss and diet and exercise and people lose weight, sometimes it's hard to say if like it's diet or it's exercise or it's the weight loss itself that is improving health outcomes. A lot of them are short, and there's a lot of errors in data analysis. And much of the research that we have on obesity in the US is funded by weight loss and drug companies, some of the ones on the right, which also influences the types of studies that are funded and published and available to the population. And then weight loss medications, there is some research that shows that people can lose a little bit of weight while they're taking it, but they have to be taking the medication. And a lot of them have been shown to be unsafe for long-term use. And so folks can't a lot of the time use them longer term. And a lot of the studies, again, have flaws. So there's high attrition in med studies. There's multiple interventions a lot of the time, and then short study length as well. And there's just a really high odds of adverse events that folks are experiencing that aren't often consistently reported. And then bariatric surgery is often advertised as a quick and easy fix, right? When really it's a lifelong diet and lifestyle change. So I feel like, I don't know, you always see photos like the one on the right where they'll say things like release the inner you, or like you can start again, or things like that, where it's like extremely dehumanizing, first of all, but it also just really oversimplifies the relationship between weight and health. And so I want to just quickly show some of the risks, right, of bariatric surgery, which are increased risk of suicide or self-harm, increased substance use, fatigue, fear about food. Also, depending on the surgery, you could be damaging a really crucial organs in the absorption and the breakdown of nutrients, right? Like the stomach and the small intestine. And those are really important for just getting nutrition, but also for healing. And so it's important to think about like, what are the benefits and what are the risks if we're doing that? And is just losing weight through whatever means possible worth it? It's also just costly, and there's a lot of a lack of consensus about the data and a lack of research on long-term effects. So just to sum that up, because I know I went through a lot of things very quickly, 90% of diets fail. So if this was a drug, we would not use it. And dieting is a consistent predictor of future weight gain. And weight loss medications and bariatric surgery lack solid long-term research and cause multiple adverse side effects. And so this is what we use most readily, but is this the approach that that we really want to use? Is it as effective as we want it to be at helping people improve their health? So we're going to talk a little bit about how food restriction or dieting, right? If you're not eating enough, how does that impact our bodies? Because we prescribe weight loss all the time in medicine. People just everywhere are dieting or trying to lose weight. So what does that do in our bodies? So physiologically, our bodies are super resistant to change. We're pretty good at gaining weight, but we're not very good at losing weight. And that's evolutionarily advantageous. And our bodies have a very, very strong and efficient system of helping us know when we're hungry and when we're full and stimulating our appetite, so we get the nutrients that we need to survive. But when we listen to outside cues, right, maybe we're on a diet and it's telling you, you can only eat at certain times of the day, or maybe you have a calorie limit that you've hit already and you want to eat more, but you can't because you have your calorie limit, right? When we listen to those signals, instead of listening to our own hunger and fullness, that hunger fullness system starts to shut down. And so we get less good at hearing those signals and understanding when we're full or when we're hungry. And so our bodies, because they're trying to keep us alive always, if they notice that somebody's losing weight or maybe eating less food, they're not like, okay, I see you, you're on a diet, we're trying to get that beach body, let's go, I'll help you lose 15 pounds, right? It doesn't say that. It says, wait a minute, we're not getting food. This is dangerous. This is how starvation occurs. This is how we die. This is not good, right? And so what it does in response to that is it kicks in this really effective mechanism of making sure that we don't continue to lose weight. And so some examples of that are increasing our ghrelin, which is our hunger hormone. I always say like your stomach growls when you have ghrelin. And it decreases our leptin, which is our fullness hormone. So we're hungry more often, we're full less easily. It increases fat storage more efficiently, causes more carbohydrate cravings. And in general, like when we lose weight, we're more likely to reduce muscle first as a protective mechanism, and muscle uses more energy than fat. And so your resting metabolic rate is going to go down, your metabolism. And so an example of that is the Biggest Loser study. They followed participants of the Biggest Loser after 6 years of participating on the show and found that 70% of them, or 70% of the weight that they had lost was regained over that time, but their resting metabolic rate, their metabolism stayed much lower still. So then the amount of energy they needed was lower. And their leptin levels, their fullness levels also remain low. So you can see that's an example of the way that the body is kicking in to try to make sure that they regain weight. So the way that I talk to patients about this is it's like a pendulum, right? And so if anytime you pull the pendulum over to the left, right, whether you're dieting, whether there's deprivation, so a lot of folks that are food insecure might experience this because they can't get food when they might need it, and restriction. So an example, sometimes for kids, especially kids in bigger bodies, people might take food away from them or say, you can't eat this, you don't have too much of this, right? Anytime there's restriction, your body is going to kick in a safety response and pull that pendulum back to the other side. So there's going to be overeating, rebellious eating, binge eating, maybe, you know, in the example of kids, right? You see it a lot. If they go somewhere and there's food available that's not normally given to them, they might want all of it because their body is thinking that they're in a time of scarcity. There's also a lot of other impacts of food restriction. So people that aren't eating enough sometimes can have low energy, hair loss, irregular periods, a lot of hunger, right? And I think those things, like people might come in with and be like, I just don't know why this is happening, right? Like this makes no sense. And a lot of the times we don't think about the fact that people that are dieting or people that aren't eating enough can experience those things too. So there are a couple consequences of dieting, one of which is weight cycling, which is the repeated loss and regain of weight. So it's called yo-yo dieting, right? Where you go on a diet, you lose weight, you regain the weight when you go off the diet, and then you go on another diet and you lose weight, and like so on and so on. And weight cycling is much worse for your health than if you had just stayed at the body size you were at originally, no matter what body size you have. And so the study on the right was a really large study out of the UK that followed people's BMIs for 10 years. And you can see that folks that were in the quote unquote healthy BMI category, more often than not over those years were going to stay in that same BMI category. So you see less fluctuation in their weight. But as you go higher on the BMI categories, more often than not, folks that are in bigger or higher BMI categories are going to be moving in between different BMI categories, which could suggest weight cycling, like they're trying to lose weight. And this could be because of the increased pressures that folks in bigger bodies have to lose weight from everyone around them. And so it's really important to keep in mind that those folks in bigger bodies might be at higher risk for the adverse effects of weight cycling, and those often aren't considered or controlled for when we look at the relationship between health status and weight. And then dieting is also a really strong risk factor for disordered eating and eating disorders. The only difference is that eating disorders have a DSM diagnosis and disordered eating doesn't. But some examples of disordered eating are frequent dieting, restricting major food groups, anxiety or feelings of guilt and shame associated with food, a feeling of loss of control, using exercise or like restriction or purging to make up for bad food. So sometimes I feel like you'll hear people say like, oh, I had a really bad eating day today. I'm just going to eat less tomorrow, right? I'm going to go work out a ton tomorrow to make up for it. And eating disorders and disordered eating have been rising really rapidly in the US and across the world. And I think it's really important to note in medicine, because we prescribe weight loss and because people are dieting so much, a lot of these behaviors have become really normalized. We don't even catch that they're disordered. And I want to highlight that people of color, queer and trans folks experience eating disorders at higher rates than their white cishet counterparts. And this could partially be because they're experiencing homophobia, transphobia, racism, other forms of trauma, and might be using food as a way to mediate those experiences. But they're also more likely to be underdiagnosed. And so I think this speaks to this idea that we have a very specific picture of what an eating disorder looks like. And a lot of the times it's a very thin, frail white woman, right? When actually eating disorders can happen in any body, no matter the size, the ability, anything. People in larger bodies can have anorexia. People in smaller bodies can have binge eating disorder. And we really need to assess the way that we talk to people about food and the assumptions that we make about people based on their body size. And I want to highlight this quote by Alyssa Rumsey that says a child is 242 times more likely to have an eating disorder than they are to have type 2 diabetes, yet the vast majority of our public health education is spent warning parents and kids about childhood obesity. And so I think, again, this speaks to the fact that we are so worried about our kids getting fat that we have ignored the fact that a lot of them are developing really negative relationships with food in their bodies. So to sum this all up, dieting disrupts our internal hunger and fullness systems and our metabolism. It's also a significant risk factor for weight cycling, disordered eating, and shame, which are conditions that worsen our health. And just to highlight a couple books that have, again, been helpful for Srila and I in this understanding that research, Health at Every Size by Lindo Bacon, Anti-Diet by Christy Harrison, and Intuitive Eating by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch have been really helpful books in understanding this.
So really the other thing we want to kind of talk about is that encouraging weight loss is not trauma informed, and we're all hopefully in medicine trying to move towards trauma informed care. Because focusing on weight and recommending weight loss really reduces a person and their whole story and historical context and generational and ancestral context to a number. And it also ignores any role that trauma may play in the ways that their body looks or acts in terms of chronic illness. So many of you probably heard of ACEs. I'm sure most of you have, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which show the link between traumatic experiences in childhood and illness, including physical illness later in life, like autoimmune disease, heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, etc. And this was even when controlling for high risk, what we call high risk health behavior. And it showed that the more ACEs you had, the more likely you were to have these illnesses and higher morbidity and mortality. And what's really interesting to us about that study, in addition to its findings, is actually its origin story, how it even became to be a research study idea, which some of you might be familiar with. But for those who aren't, Dr. Vincent Felitti was a doctor with Kaiser in the 1980s, and he ran a research study and clinic for weight loss to help people lose weight. And as the study went on, he noticed that there was a really high attrition or dropout rate in the people who lost the most weight. So again, like Amanda had mentioned, this study was showing a really high attrition rate. And he was really puzzled by why are people leaving when they're successful at losing weight? So what did he do? He decided to actually sit down with everyone who left the study and interview them and learn about them. So he spent time with them, learning about their life, listening to their stories, listening to their narratives, And in getting that time with people and really learning about them, what he found was that an overwhelming number of them, of the people who had left the study, experienced significant childhood trauma, and a really high proportion of that trauma was sexual abuse. And what those patients had told him, many of them, was that eating for them was soothing in a lot of ways. It distanced and soothed themselves from painful thoughts and emotions and memories. And so being in this weight loss study where there was food restriction was taking in a way of an important tool that helped them to survive, to this point. And so also, some people had shared with him that they felt safer being in a larger body and less likely to be a target again. So, and when we think about potential other coping mechanisms like drug use or alcohol use, food is a safer option, especially when you don't have access to healing modalities like therapy and somatic experiencing or acupuncture, craniosacral therapy, things that can be really helpful for trauma healing. That said, it's really important to note that emotional eating and eating for self-soothing is something that everyone does regardless of body size. So this quote we wanted to share, emotional eating is often attributed to fat people, especially those who have experienced sexual abuse. However, emotional eating also occurs in thin people, and pathologizing fat people is only harmful. So it's not that all people in larger bodies have ACEs, or that all people in larger bodies emotionally eat, and that's why they're that's not what we're saying. It's more, we share this origin story mainly to highlight why it's important for any patient to really learn about their story and their narrative, historical context, both to understand the pathophysiology of their illness, but also to counsel on, when you're counseling, to do it in a trauma-informed, compassionate, and empowering way. So as we mentioned, the ACEs study included 10 categories, which included things like neglect and abuse, and a parent who was incarcerated, a parent with a mental health illness. But what the study did not include explicitly was the trauma of experiencing systems of oppression like racism and homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and fat phobia, for example, especially for people who are marginalized in those systems, which is often more complex and often a daily occurrence, and just stepping out into the world. And it also did not include the role of generational trauma in somebody's physiology. So this is a graphic from a great article titled Stress-Related Biosocial Mechanisms of Discrimination and African American Health Inequities. And I like it because it's just a great graphic that shows the linking of stress-related mechanisms and the development of chronic illness, and how that's passed down, how it can be passed down epigenetically. So there's a lot going on here, but simplified, it's showing that in response to a stressor or a threat, so in the case of this article, it's mainly focusing on interpersonal racism, but really, to me, it's it could be any, if you think about the nervous system, it's really any stressor that is kind of perpetual and happening all the time. Your sympathetic nervous system and your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis are working together to send stress hormones throughout your body to get you ready. And this influences metabolic function like blood pressure, blood glucose, lipids, and immune function. So for example, macrophages will secrete cytokines like IL-2 and IL-6. And in the short term, that's adaptive. We developed this for a reason, evolutionarily, to be able to change our metabolic function to escape a threat and become safe. But in the long term, again, when stress is chronic, when it's passed down through generations because of systems of oppression that have continued, and epigenetically, there's this really high allostatic load, which contributes to many of the illnesses we see today and what we call metabolic syndrome: hypertension, diabetes, cholesterol, and coronary artery disease. Excuse me. So one example of this, just to kind of narrow it down, I think about insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes and thinking about the role of cortisol. So this graphic is showing the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis pathway. And again, we know a primary function of this is to regulate metabolic and immune function. So metabolizing carbohydrates, fats, proteins, gluconeogenesis, immune function. And cortisol in particular regulates circulating blood glucose, fat storage, and insulin responsiveness, as well as immune response. So when the HPA axis is activated, this diagram is showing the effects of cortisol on many parts of the body, including the liver and the pancreas, with increased insulin resistance, decreased insulin sensitivity, and increased gluconeogenesis. because like, again, evolutionarily, if we're running away from a bear and having this response in our body, you want to have more blood glucose available, right? It's energy, our muscles need it. But again, what happens when that stressor is constant and when there's been, generations of extreme harm and trauma. And I think a lot about, like, for example, the indigenous people in this country whose ancestors experienced genocide and land loss and forced disconnection from their ancestral healing practices and their spirituality, forced disconnection from relationship with land and food cultivation practices. That's a really, really high allostatic load. So of course, metabolic and immune function are affected, and we see many of these chronic illnesses today. And we say this because, in my medical training, like the focus with diabetes, for example, was often on weight loss, eat this, not that, nutrition, exercise. And it's not that nutrition is not important or moving our bodies isn't important, but it's more that, like, what is the harm when we're not acknowledging this kind of deep generational impact on physiology from experiencing system depression, and we're not addressing that stress response if we're only focusing on someone's body size and even only focusing on behavior without the understanding that this is like a lot more than that. So I really love this quote that kind of just sums it up. This is by Dr. Anthony Ryan Hatch, who wrote a fantastic book about kind of racism in the idea of metabolic syndrome. And the quote is that bodies don't just exist in social and physical space absent any influence. Bodies are always being influenced by the social context in which they live. And this is especially for people in marginalized bodies.
So we're going to talk about some of the forms of trauma that are more specific to folks in larger bodies. And so weight stigma is one of those things. It's the discrimination or stereotyping based on a person's weight. So examples might be receiving unsolicited negative comments or concerns about your weight from anyone, being charged higher insurance premiums based on your body size, not being able to find comfortable chairs, airplane seats, things like that. And I'm just going to highlight two a little more serious examples of the way that weight stigma can impact folks' safety and livelihood. So the first one, there was a study done in 2020 that followed folks that were trying to undergo gender confirmation surgery that also were in larger bodies, and they were required to lose weight in order to get the surgery. And almost none of them could lose the weight. And so they were all denied gender confirmation surgery. And so I think that's really important. And it just highlights the ways that fat phobia and a lack of understanding about the needs of folks in larger bodies and the lack of research on safe practices causes a lot of gatekeeping in terms of medical access. And then another example is in the trial of Daniel Pantaleo for the murder of Eric Garner in 2014. Pantaleo's attorney used Eric Garner's body size as a justification for his death, saying basically that he was close to death anyways because he was in a bigger body. And so I think the gaslighting and the shame that occurs are having serious impacts on the livelihood and the safety of folks in larger bodies. And so, like Srila was saying, weight stigma is a threat. It activates our stress response. And I just want to give an example of a patient that I talked to who, when he knows that he has to go to the doctor, he's on edge the whole day. He's stressed, he's overthinking, he's worried about it. He weighs himself multiple times a day and just it feels activated the whole day. And so then leading up, going into the appointment, right, waiting for the provider to come in, knowing that he's going to have to step on that scale, knowing that he's going to have a conversation about his weight with his doctor, like that leaves him in this state of threat, this activated stress response for hours, right? And so this is something that's happening for folks in larger bodies in a lot of spaces, multiple times a day, right? And like Srila was saying, weight stigma or having that activated stress response is super bad for our health. And so this is something also that we don't control for a lot of the times when we're looking at the relationship between weight and health. And just to show you too, right, the rule of thumb in medicine is to do no harm, right? But the term, when we say morbid obesity, the term morbid means indicative of death or disease, and obesity means having eaten until fat. And so that in itself is extremely harmful and extremely dehumanizing to use that term to describe people. And it's also caused a lot of an increase in weight stigma. It's increased by 66%. With this like rise in public health campaigns to end the obesity epidemic. It's also one of the, it's really prevalent in healthcare. So having weight stigma in healthcare can lead to avoidance of healthcare because people don't want to be shamed, a negative relationship between BMI and preventative care, because folks, you know, if they're not going to the provider as often, they're not going to get like their cancer screenings or things like that. It can cause worse care. Folks in larger bodies report rates 3 times higher than people with average BMIs that they're denied appropriate medical care. And it can also lead to misdiagnosis. And so just a quick story, Ellen Maud Bennett was a patient who came in to see her doctor. She wasn't feeling well. Her stomach was kind of getting a little bigger, and she was concerned, and her doctor told her she just needed to lose weight, right, over and over. And it actually turned out that she had cancer. And by the time that they caught it, she only had a couple more months to live. And so she really wanted her story to be amplified and people to know the ways that this happens in medicine. And then we're going to talk about kids a lot next week, but really just highlighting that weight-based bullying is one of the most frequent types of bullying experienced in schools. And it's also happening a lot of the times by parents and family members. And so kids, if they live in larger bodies, are often experiencing that stress or that stigma in all the environments that they're in, potentially for years and years and years. And it's important to think about the impact that that can have on their bodies and the way that they cope with that experience. And I just want to highlight a couple of books, again, that have been so wonderful and helpful in helping us understand the experience of folks in larger bodies. And so Heavy by Keisha Lehman, Fat Girls in Black Bodies by Dr. Joy Cox, and Hunger by Roxane Gay are amazing books that kind of highlight their experiences of living in larger bodies. So you might be thinking, okay, but like nutrition is important. What about diet related diseases? And Srila mentioned this a little bit, right? But you know, we're not saying that nutrition, diet, and exercise are not important. They're extremely important. And there's a lot of research that shows that you know, diet and exercise can improve health outcomes for anybody, regardless of what body that they're in. They don't just need to be in a thinner body to experience those health outcomes. But really, when you look at the modifiable social determinants of health, diet and exercise is just one piece of that. And there are a lot of other things that impact our health. And so I think it's also really important to know that not everybody has a positive experience with food, right? And it's really important to understand those feelings when we talk to people about food and eating in medical appointments. And so we also can't talk about food without discussing the power dynamics that have existed historically due to colonialism and capitalism. So things like Srila was mentioning, land theft, the forced removal of people from their homes, separation of families, have caused a disconnection and erasure of people from their cultural practices and a piece of their identity. And mainstream society has also minimized the nutritional value of certain cultural foods if they're not like relevant in our culture, right? And you also see capitalism a lot of the times when the US, like in our society, will deem foods like superfoods, like avocados or quinoa. And so when they're popular here, everyone wants them. We shift everything to mass produce them to come to the US. And that disrupts the food production, economy, and access for people that traditionally eat those foods. And so it's important to keep all of those things in mind when we talk to people about food and just talk to them about dietary changes. And I just want to highlight Karen Washington is a really amazing food justice activist. And she coined the term food apartheid, which is the structural oppression based on race and class that limits access to power and resources related to food and land. and results in poor health and poor people. So overall, right, when we talk about diet and body size as things that we have total control of and we can change, that makes health a personal and moral responsibility. Like it's our responsibility for all of those things. And it shifts the focus away from the fact that health is a societal and political issue. And it minimizes that food access and body liberation are social justice issues. So I'm just going to sum up with 2 slides. I know we talked about a lot in this presentation, but overall, I'm trying to move the screen. Having a focus on weight has not been improving health outcomes for most people across the weight spectrum. Instead, this approach reduces complex human beings to a number on the scale. It denies the natural existence of larger bodies and puts people at risk for disordered eating and eating disorders, weight stigma, weight cycling, and physical and psychological harm. It ignores the role of trauma and systemic inequities caused by racism and white supremacy in health outcomes. And I want to close out with this quote by Mikey Mercedes, who's an amazing fat liberation activist, that says that fat people deserve to exist without structural and interpersonal violence, regardless of how close or far they are to health by whatever standard we are measuring that by. The priority is to sever the link between healthfulness and inherent worth, between healthfulness and moral alignment, between the relentless pursuit of health and the right to be treated with respect. So I will end there. Let me stop sharing my screen. Oops, that's not how I do that. I know we said so many things in a short amount of time, but thank you all so much for being here. And Cease, I don't know if we want to have any time for discussion. I know it's 8:57.
We have 2.5 minutes, so absolutely. There are comments dropping in the chat of people talking about supporting everything that you've said and giving other examples, really just reiterating what you said. I'm a little overwhelmed. It's an awful lot to take in a short period of time, but I don't question anything that you shared with us. I'm really interested in, like, what did you suggest? 12 books? We're never going to get that all read, but you also said you had a Google link with all the resources, and I'm super excited about getting my hands on that.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, yes, there's a Google, we'll send the slides out, and there's a Google document. Amanda is extremely organized and like synthesized all this information in a Google Doc. And so that slide is a really great source. But I just want to emphasize, like, for myself, as someone who is like a physician and went through family medicine training, and and somebody within privilege, like I started my journey probably like 2017 from reading Roxane Gay's book Hunger, which was just for fun, like not within, and then, so anyway, just to say that it's like a journey, especially for, it's just so ingrained, a lot of this stuff. And so I don't want anyone to feel, I think what a lot of feelings can come up around, especially if you're like a provider, and like around shame and, just sort of like take your time with it. There's lots, I think this is there's a lot of information out there, and especially if you're medical training, it's just so ingrained, I think, weight loss and BMI. And so it takes time to sort of like unravel that. But yeah, just everyone be really compassionate with yourself. And luckily there's so many wonderful people to learn from. We listed some sources, but I saw in the chat that people were sharing other authors and activists and websites and books. And so I'll definitely check the ones out that I haven't seen. So thank you for sharing those in the chat.
Yeah, I'll put that list together too. Go ahead, Amanda.
I was just gonna say, I think we said this at the beginning, but just as a reminder, next week is gonna be a lot more chill, less information, and really talking about like how we do talk about this with patients and practicing that and exploring that a little bit. So in case folks were wondering, I saw a comment in the chat. We'll talk a lot about how to translate this into the clinic visit.
Yeah, we have breakout groups and then including pediatric. So yeah, it'll be different next week.
I'll make sure when I send out an announcement that I let people know that this one's available and where they can listen in, and then let them know what's coming next week. So people know they can build on what we heard today. And some great suggestions in the chat about, that this should be part of our onboarding at Howard Brown. We purport to have utilized trauma-informed care. If this is part of trauma-informed care, we should add it into everything. So yeah, absolutely. Anybody can come next week, Amy. Please invite folks that weren't able to attend today. I'll send an email out straight away after I gather some information and have a place to post the Zoom recording so people know where they can go and listen to it. All right. Thank you both so much. I can't even tell you how much I personally enjoyed this, and I can't wait for next week. Everybody else, you'll see an email come out fairly soon with links and information for next week. And then I'll give a couple reminders next week so folks who couldn't make it today can join for next week. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Enjoy your Friday. It's Friday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Absolutely amazing. Somebody yesterday said, "Thank you for the fire hose of information." And I thought,
Yeah,
that's exactly it.
I was telling Amanda, like, her which, this is like all props to Amanda Montgomery, who did, like, I had, like, a little part of this. But I told Amanda the way that I feel like this is like bam, bam, bam. It's like this point, this point, this point, this point. It's a lot of data. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
Also
So,
important.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording. I'm going to pause it so I can go through the chat real quick, and then I'll save it so we have it for folks to listen in that weren't able to be here today. Thank you both so much.
okay.
My computer is doing something funky, so I can't leave.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to pause the recording. So if you want to keep chatting, that's fine. I'm going to do a quick scan of the chat and then I'll shut it down. So take your time.